Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well on this beautiful Saturday morning. So, today it's raining where I am. So, we're going to talk about some really interesting topics that have been percolating in my mind lately. I am a business professor and I like to study the world. I love to study the globe. And I especially like to focus on business and whether business is even possible in some parts of the world. And what are the hindrances to business and to operations? And why are some countries more competitive than others? These are questions that I consider quite frequently. And recently, I've been looking into the impact, actually, for years, I've been looking into the impact of socialism on business and operating around the world. But lately, I've been specifically focusing on Eastern Europe and Europe more generally, and some of the challenges that Europe has had since the European Union and since the European Commission, the European Parliament, a lot of the stuff that's in Europe, some of the regulations that are in Europe, we're going to talk about those. But I also want to talk about some of the things that have been going on in the world, not just in Europe, but in Africa, in Central and South America, in China. We're going to talk about human rights, the rule of law, socialism, property rights, gun rights, places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, China. We're going to talk about all of these places. We're going to talk about birth rates, some of the challenges we have between birth rates, and more. Yes, so Skylar Fiction. Welcome, Skylar. I haven't seen you in so long. And so it's good to see you. He says, do I even know the difference between socialism and communism? Well, yes, it's the idea of the collective ownership of the means of production for socialism. Communism is the government ownership of the means of production. However, the lines between the two have been blurred quite a bit in places of Africa, many of the African countries, and also, of course, in places in South America, Central and South America, particularly in places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. We also have places in like Senegal. We've got the former communist countries in Eastern Europe and some of the obligations that they have to the government today and why business is so difficult to operate in so many of these places. Also, we're going to talk a bit about a few other things. Like let me back up here and let's talk about how this all came about. So I want to say welcome everybody. And Norway, I am going to talk about. So thank you, Skylar. I'm not only going to talk about Norway and Germany. Thank you. I'm going to mention all of this because I've been studying this quite a bit. And I've got quite a bit to say. So we'll also talk about Denmark, Sweden. We're going to talk about the Nordic countries and how they have been able to operate with very high taxes, but cradle to grave social security nets. We're going to definitely talk about that. I've got a lot to say. I made a huge spreadsheet. I'm doing a consulting project, possibly with one of my coworkers. We're going to be working with a company that's global, that has major affiliations with a major multinational corporation. And we're looking at we're looking actually all throughout Europe specifically, but we're going to end up going, especially in the Saudi region, after going out of, we're going to go through Europe, the European Union, the 27 countries there, but we're also going to talk about the Nordic countries, and then we'll focus on the Saudi Arabian, the Arabian region, and we'll look into Africa, other business opportunities in South America. So we're looking at a lot of this stuff, and I have a lot to say. So it's not just as easy as a 1, 2, 3, but I am going to break it down for you guys. So let's go back to Karl Marx, talk about where all this came from. Now, I happen to be potentially able to obtain German citizenship, believe it or not. My brother has been living in Berlin since 2011, I believe. He's been there for quite a while, and he just found out a little loophole in the law that is going to be able to get us a dual citizenship if we apply, because my grandmother was her citizenship was unfairly taken away when she married a foreigner. They made women lose their citizenship in Germany, and they allowed males to keep it if you married a foreigner way back when, like in the 1930s and 40s. And so the beautiful thing in Germany is that I apparently this little loophole goes till I think 2030, 2031. I have to learn basic German language, and I have to show all the paperwork affiliated with my grandmother's citizenship. And that's apparently going to be able to give me dual citizenship. So I'm really excited about that because I want access to not only Germany, but the European Union, but apparently it'll also pass down to my kids. So I'm definitely going to do that. So I'm affiliated with German myself. have German roots there. Also happen to have Norwegian roots, English roots, and Irish roots. And so I tend to come from the northern and western part of Europe myself. And so I study these places intensely because I do find them terribly interesting. And so I just want to say thank you, guys. We're going to talk about some of this stuff. So going back to Karl Marx, unfortunately, some terrible things have come out of Germany, including Karl Marx, the Frankfurt School, which basically took Karl Marx's idea and extended them to social theory. And a lot of that, unfortunately, ended up over in the USSR, China, Cambodia, Vietnam, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and other societies in the world. Unfortunately, it's like a disgusting, it's like a roach. It's like you kill a roach and it just keeps going all over the world. So the idea with Marxism is that we were going to relinquish property rights. The problem with Karl Marx is not only the fact that he himself was a tremendous mooch who never worked a day in his life. His kids, he has 7 kids with a woman named Jenny. And apparently he was busy traveling around with Engels, being supported by Engels, and not supporting himself, but busy writing the Communist Manifesto and other things where he talked about what he called power differences in class, the proletariat being the regular workers and the bourgeoisie. He followed a pattern where he demonized the bourgeoisie, which is the idea that also Hugo Chavez followed in Venezuela. So let me break down how this occurs. So he looked at business and industrialization in the 1800s. He looked at that. He was born in 1818 and he died in 1883. And he looked at industrialization and he saw some of the bad sides of it. And during that time, of course, we had people who had been historically through the centuries, people were much more agrarian, working on farms, having big families. A lot of people in the 1800s, especially in Europe where he was located, he was in Germany, a lot of the people started noticing that the factories were operating and people had some pretty terrible conditions in the factories. So that is no doubt. So Karl Marx was able to make that observation that the factories were kind of terrible to work in. And what he decided to do was write a book about it and talk about how bad the owners of the companies were. Now, people have taken those ideas to demonize big businesses and to demonize business owners and even little businesses and even farmers, farm owners, people who owned farms for the past couple of hundred years almost. So unfortunately, we've seen this come out. I think it was around 1848 that his Communist Manifesto came out. So it's almost 200 years we've had those ideas. Now, they went into the communist ideas, and we saw that with what occurred in the last century in the USSR and in Cambodia and China. The idea was that, and it led to 120 million people's early demise because of starvation and other causes, or being thrown into the gulags. But what happened was, when the communists and the Bolsheviks, especially in the USSR, took over around 1917 and they overthrew the Tsar, was they decided that people were going to be motivated in this sort of communist utopia. And the idea of a communist utopia is that everyone's going to be happy with the government taking everything over, and it didn't really matter how much effort you put in. Everyone was going to share the same outputs. So to make that work, they had to basically squash a lot of the people who are the intellectuals, the people who are the business owners, and certainly the farm owners to make this work. And so how did they do that? How did they squash that? Well, they simply took the land away and they threw a lot of those people into prison. We have this documented in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, which he wrote at great risk to himself, and it was published in the early 1970s. And it truly opened up the world's eyes to the demonic behind communism. And what happened was he went around and interviewed a whole bunch of people in the gulags in Russia, where he had been thrown unfairly into prison himself. Apparently, they would come in the middle of the night, they would arrest people and throw them into prison. And they would throw you into prison even if you were a kid who was living on a farm where your parents didn't send enough of the product. In fact, that is called 100% of your produce to the collective, to the cities. If you tried to dare to go into the middle of the night and to grab some of the crops yourself, you could be thrown into the gulag because you weren't participating in communism enough. And so anyone who was considered anti-communist was thrown into the gulags. They threw church leaders into the gulags. Anyone who was leading religious worship was thrown into the gulags. Lots of people were. The Orthodox Church was, if you didn't affiliate with the government in some way, you could be thrown into the church. And that's one of the challenges that the Orthodox Christians in that part of the world has had to face, is the leadership in those churches in many cases have affiliated, unfortunately, with with these governmental regimes, so that they prevent their own demise or anything like that. So what happened was, again, they destroyed businesses and they destroyed human motivation. And the problem with Karl Marx when he was writing is they didn't have the studies that we have now of human motivation. And that's what I focus on, excuse me, in my job. So in my job, I'm a business professor. I teach leadership courses, human resource management. I call it human capital leadership. I also teach ethics in business, and I teach cross-cultural communication, cross-cultural competencies. I also teach career development. I teach research methods. I actually teach quite a few courses in business at the executive doctorate level, the executive MBA level, the plain MBA level, and then the undergraduate level, which tends to be in just one class. My undergraduate class is one class, which is a senior, junior level management class, which we focus on human resource management, and where I've written my own textbook. But anyway, I digress. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I have been studying this stuff for a long time. So I'm trying to tell you what happened in the last century in the USSR. And fortunately, Ronald Reagan, who was President Reagan, who was elected in 1980 in the United States, he had 2 terms in the United States, and he had the vast majority of the electoral vote. People overwhelmingly supported him because we wanted to get away from the ridiculously high interest rates of Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan read The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen, which is an excellent book I highly recommend. But he also, with other government leaders, read The Gulag Archipelago. And his reading of that and his pairing with the leader of the USSR at the time is what led to the fall of communism in 1989. So the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and that led to the breakup of communism in the USSR and in Eastern Europe and in other countries of the world. So today, who is still a communist? Well, declared communists are in places like China, North Korea, and Laos. But semi-communism has also been operating in places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Even though they might call it socialism, it's truly communism. And how do you know that? Well, you know, because they applied this 101 approach to starting a socialist government. So here are the steps if you want to start a socialist government. So step 1 is to eliminate the idea of human rights. So in the United States and in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we have this idea that we're all afforded the rule of law. Now, what is the rule of law? The rule of law said every citizen is subject to the law. So no one is above the law. In other words, your government leaders should be held to the same account that regular societal members are held to. That's where we get to John Kerry, which I'm going to get to in just a second. So you can see this image here. You're probably wondering, why do I have an image of John Kerry at the World Economic Forum in Davos from 2024? Picture of a reporter, attaching himself to him. Well, I'm going to get to that in just a second because this is all related. So let's go back. We're still right now operating in the fall of communism starting 1989. We have Russia coming out. It was really struggling in the early 1990s. Many of the European economies in the eastern part of Europe, Bulgaria, Estonia, and others were definitely struggling in the early 1990s, and they had to figure out how to get afoot. Well, in those societies, one of the ways to operate is to have the government have a lot of control. And in those societies, it actually ended up being a big hindrance to business because to start a business as a little entrepreneur in many places required that you had to pay the government a huge fee, which oftentimes was 5-6 times what the average salary was per person in your country. But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. Let me first go back to this communist idea. So currently we have Daniel Ortega, who's leading Nicaragua. He's running a very corrupt government, and even the United States has said they don't want anything. They're putting sanctions on Nicaragua due to its horrible socialism. And the reason why I'm kind of intermingling socialism and communism, in case Scholar Fiction, who's in here, wants to know, is because they're extremely related. When Hugo Chavez took over Venezuela, he started talking about the benefits of socialism. And so what they did is they decided to take government and supplement the prices of certain things. And they limited manufacturers of different foodstuffs and also oil and gas from charging high prices, or just charging regular prices, supply and demand types of prices for products. And of course, ended up driving them out of business. Now, what Hugo Chavez did is a model that has been repeated in other places. So let me tell you what it is, just so you know, and watch for it in the United States. The idea is, first, you take away human rights and you don't hold everybody equally accountable, and you take away the rule of law. Now, we don't have a rule of law in places like China right now, and in some other parts of South and Central America. Every citizen is not subject to the same law. In fact, some would argue the same exact things going on here in the United States with our government, but I won't get into that right in this video. And the other thing that we have as a problem is property rights. And so Socialism 101 is the idea to take away property rights. So what did Hugo Chavez do? First, before he took away the property rights, he took away the gun rights. So you have everyone relinquish their guns. And when you do that, the only people who have the guns are your own thugs. So Hugo Chavez's thugs had guns. They ended up what they called expropriating or nationalizing a bunch of industries. They took over the cement, the steel, the telecom, the electricity, hotels, recreational facilities, petroleum, and transportation industries. They drove Venezuela, which was once one of the wealthiest countries in South America, to the ground. Since 2015, first it was Chavez, now it's Nicolas Maduro. He's been operating. Maduro's been there since 2013. Apparently Chavez's family is sitting on a couple $1 billion, but everybody else, the vast majority of Venezuelans, are starving. And 7.1 million of them have fled Venezuela since 2015. So we have a very significant portion of people who fled into other countries, like the United States. Many are coming over our border. And also many from Nicaragua and other places are coming over our border due to the extreme starvation situation in their countries. And so we have that going on now in South America. We've got a person called Lula da Silva, who is also very much leaning to the left, operating in Brazil. And again, what does that mean? It means heavy governmental programs. It means the idea that you're paying the government. And that works in some places with certain conditions. Here's where it can work. If you want heavy governmental programs in a place like Brazil with a very large population and a very diverse population, unless everyone shares the same cultural values, which says a strong work ethic, the idea that work is very valuable, the idea that you want to work and everyone should work, and those kind of things. Unless you have that, and you've got extremely high levels of trust, not only in your peers in a society, but also in the government, unless you have those conditions, it's not going to work. Which is why if you go to the Nordic countries and you go to places like Sweden, which is a very small country, it's only got about 10 million people, which is about half of what Florida has, just to give you something to look that against, or Norway, which only has about 5 million people, or Denmark, which also has a very small population. A government that has a lot of control and a lot of power, and where the taxes are extremely high. So in Denmark, if you buy an automobile, your taxes are about 200% of the cost of the car. In Sweden, your taxes are about 60% on say a 60,000 US dollar equivalent. So if you're making 60,000 US dollars in Sweden, you're paying about 60%. You do have a very strong healthcare system. You do have an education system. You're taken care of from cradle to grave, meaning that your daycare is taken care of by the government. Your K through 12 is taken care of. and your college is taken care of so long as you went to college and chose a major. And we're accepted in the university, of course. You can't just get in there with low grades, but you had to have good grades and you're accepted into the particular major that the government feels is worthy of a study. So you're not going to be probably able to choose those majors that end in the word studies. You're going to have to choose a major that actually has a practical uh, work related to it. So anyway, so in these governments, in those kind of places, very high taxes and a government that they don't consider themselves socialist, by the way. They protest against that because they equate that with communism. But they do consider it a very democratic society, very high taxes, but you are taken care of with healthcare and things like that. And there's very, very high trust in the government. That is why it doesn't work in the United States, where we have about 332 million people in the United States, way more than they have in those little teeny societies. And it doesn't work in Brazil. It doesn't work in many South American societies because they don't have the trust in the government. And so when you try to operate a program like that, it just doesn't work. That's one of the challenges that also has happened in Europe. So let's talk about some challenges in Europe right now. In Europe right now, what happened in Europe is ever since World War II is there have been the European societies decided to get together. And today the European Union consists of 27 member countries. Not within the European Union, tend to be the Nordic countries and Switzerland. They do benefit, though, from some of the regulations and laws of the European Union. Now, the challenges of the European Union, and one of the reasons why Great Britain decided to leave, which is what they call Brexit 2020, one of the reasons why Britain decided to leave was because of some of the regulations, very strict regulations. And the fact that a lot of times the wealthier countries, places like Germany, ended up having to sort of support some of the poorer countries. You probably remember the acronym PIGS, PIIGS, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. They were struggling in recent years. And so some of the wealthier countries, the taxes were going towards people in those poorer countries to help sustain. And a lot of those poorer countries were required to enact different sorts of they were basically they had to figure out how to restrict some government entitlements and things like that to make their society more competitive. So let's talk about doing business and making societies more competitive and some of the challenges that you face. So if I were trying to look at, actually, before we do that, let's first get into why I've got a picture of John Kerry right here. So you're probably wondering, John Kerry wants to save, but by I think it's 2050, he thinks that he can keep the climate from increasing at 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And to do that, he wants to squeeze the farmers. And so you've probably seen farmer protests, which I'll show you in just a second. The problem with John Kerry is he flies around the world on his private plane, and he's just like many of these other billionaires and millionaires who go to Davos in Switzerland every year around January for the World Economic Forum, where they have this belief that this little elite group of business people and very wealthy government leaders around the world, Prince Charles is affiliated with it and others, they have this idea that they're going to enact these great ideas and they're going to solve climate change and everything that's going on in the world by restricting carbon emissions. And so to do that, Kerry identified that the farmlands, unfortunately, due to methane coming out of cows and the like, are unfortunately leading to some of the carbon emissions. So they want to heavily restrict them. And so Europe has enacted very strict laws on the farmers. In fact, they've squeezed the farmers to a tremendous extent. Now, the problem is these people who are saying that we all need to be sustainable and we need to reduce our carbon footprint, they are huge hypocrites because they themselves are doing things that are really nasty to the government, like flying around on their private planes and accepting climate change awards. Like, can you imagine the hypocrisy of flying into a country and accepting an award for climate change reduction? I mean, it's totally disgusting. And it's kind of like the idea of the lords and the serfs. Okay, so that's what's really a problem. So let's take a look at what he had to say to a reporter who confronted him with his massive, disgusting hypocrisy.
Year that you come here. You think it's worth it? Peasants pay for your crimes?
That's a stupid question.
Is it really?
We're done.
We're done.
We are done now.
Don't grab.
See, he grabs climate. It's so hypocritical. Call it a stupid question. How come he gets to fly around on private planes while the rest of us have to have these massive restrictions? Now, just to show you what the massive restrictions look like, in case you're curious, just so you can see, let me show you an image of what the farmers are doing and why the farmers are so upset, just so in case you haven't been paying attention to this. Now, this is going on in places like Germany, France, Scotland. We've got lots of protests going on in the world, and the farmers are extremely upset. So I hope you guys can see this. So let me just double check that you can see what I'm putting up here. So we've got protests going on in Europe. Again, why are people protesting? Well, they see this insane hypocrisy with people saying we're going to save the environment by 1.5 degrees, and we're going to do it by, we're better than thee. Look at the farmers here. This is in Paris. You can see right here. I've been on that street before. We've got others just pointing out to the fact that they're frustrated. These are the people providing the food. Now, they're also protesting the fact that some of the imports coming in from Ukraine are coming in without the same level of taxes. Without the same restrictions that some of the other places have. Okay, so you can see just a few of the images of the farmer protest. Unfortunately, our news stations aren't playing enough of this. And so we just see it. You can see the German flag back there. A lot of these people were gassed, unfortunately, by some of the policemen. Again, farming, the art of losing money while working 400 hours a month to feed people you think you are trying to kill them, who think you are trying to kill them. That is the epitome. That is the crux of what's going on right here. And so this is a real shame. And so what I wanted to point out, I'm just going to give you a few ideas for what it takes to run a business and some of the places that you can go if you want to find information that's pretty helpful as far as doing business across the world, and why the problem with these ideas, the socialist and giving a lot of taxes to the government in many countries, especially that we've seen even in the United States, is that sadly there are some levels of corruption. There's a lot of lower levels of trust. Can you trust the government? A lot of people feel, especially with like what just went on recently with Trump, with this woman who accused him of raping her in a dressing room. And then he said something like, "This is ridiculous." He said some words like that. Next thing you know, they decide to clamp a bunch of millions of dollars on him, even though we really have no support for her claims. I mean, this is one of those, okay, we want to do whatever we can do to make sure this man doesn't get to power. Now, it's only infuriating people when they do this kind of stuff. This only infuriates people when they see this double standard being applied. You've got Hunter Biden literally dropping a cocaine bag in the White House, and everyone knows it's him, and they're not going to hold him accountable. But yet around the country, I'm sure people are in prison right now because of the same sort of thing. Just cops arrest them because of their drugs, what they have their drugs on them. Same thing with Trump. I mean, this accusation that's totally unfounded from, I don't know, a couple decades ago. She has no support, and yet everyone's jumping on it like it's the truth. It's the exact same thing we saw with Supreme Court nominee when he was a nominee. We saw with him, with that Christine Blasey Ford, who had also waged these ridiculous accusations. She couldn't even remember where she was. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is absurd. And this stuff makes my blood boil. I mean, if you want to see my blood boil, it's when I see accusations coming from women that aren't even supported, and it's just disgusting. And so, all right. So anyway, so if you want to be competitive, I'm going to switch gears really quickly just to talk about some more business stuff. If you want to be competitive in operating around the world, some of the things that you need to think about doing, you need to focus on basic economics. So in the if you were focusing, I'm going to zero in on Bulgaria for a second, because Bulgaria is a teeny little country, Eastern Europe. Just to give you an idea of what some of the restrictions are, because I can take that and apply it to why they've had difficulties in these countries. Number one, the birth rate. The birth rate is a tremendous problem. In the United States, thankfully, our birth rate's high enough for sustainability. In China and all over Europe right now, the birth rate is so low. Like in Italy, I believe it's only around 1.24. It's not high enough to sustain. So they actually need migrants to come in, because if they're going to support older people through their very heavy welfare systems, they need to have younger people supporting the program, because it's like one of those systems, pay into Peter to pay to Paul. So people put money into the system to fund older people, and if very few very few younger people are there, they're not going to have enough support for their systems. And so with these very low birth rates, which do stem from some of the abortion laws, which started in Russia, coincidentally, USSR, in the early 1920s, have unfortunately ended up killing millions of people that we could have used on this planet. But I digress. Okay, so you can look at the European economy. You can look at Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a little place that has experienced serious challenges and other things that include regulatory unpredictability, inefficient bureaucracy, slow-moving courts, corruption, entrenched interests, market challenges. We've got a lot of challenges going on in places like that. We also have a couple of benefits, like the low flat tax rate, 10% if you're private or in a business. So that tends to be a pretty good thing. Real estate's relatively cheap. They've got some stability in inflation and those kind of factors. So those are important. But the problem with if you do decide you're going to go there as an employer, and just like the rest of Europe, there are these contracts. So if you want to employ a person and you realize that this person's not working very well for you, not doing a good job, in the United States, we have what they call at-will laws. You can hire and fire at will. Unfortunately, in many other parts of the world, including Africa and Europe, they have different kinds of laws. So if you employ somebody and they get past maybe, say, a 90-day probation period, and you want to let them go for poor work or anything like that, you have to actually sit down with the government and explain to the government why you're letting this person go. You might have to pay very high severance packages. You might have to do a lot of things like that. So that makes it difficult, and that makes a lot of employers say, you know what, we're not going to call you a permanent employer. Rather, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a contract. And to make sure that the contract doesn't turn into what the government would consider permanent employment and thus subject the employer to the restrictions I just mentioned. To make sure that doesn't happen, what happens is a lot of people might say, okay, here's the contracts for a year. And as soon as the government says it's going to turn into this permanent thing, they switch it over and say, okay, you have to stop working for us for 5 days, and then we'll start a new contract so we can't be subject to this permanent thing. So you can see that kind of challenge. Unionization is also another challenge. So in Europe, they have extremely high levels of unionization. Those are labor unions where they have collective bargaining. Another, from the employer's perspective, that makes it extremely difficult if a person's unionized to let them go for non-performance. Extremely difficult, and that can be a big challenge. This is not just this is in France, Germany, other places. We've got very, very difficult times letting people go. Young women have a very difficult time trying to find work in some of these places because they're of the maternity age. And if you look into European laws and you look into places like into the maternity system, you might look at the European Parliament and look at the levels of what you can expect. Like, for example, in the European Parliament, it says that Bulgaria, women get 90% paid prenatal leave for 6 weeks. So before you have the baby, you're paid 90% of your salary. For 12 weeks after, you're given 90% of your salary. And then for up to 52 weeks after that, in total, so another, say, 40 weeks, you're given unpaid postnatal leave. If you're a father, you can have 2 weeks of 90-day paid postnatal as well. So there's some different things that are out there. And so that is a challenge, because for employers, when they look at women, they're going to say, geez, I don't know if I want to employ women when we have these very strict maternity policies. Now, what does the United States have? We have 12 weeks of unpaid leave under the Family Medical Leave Act for people who have been employed for a year. So we have that, but a lot of companies do offer paid leave. Why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing it up as far as like my idea on socialism. I'm bringing it up because in the European Union, which again is operated out of the European Commission in Brussels. In places like that, in South America, in many countries, in China, in other places, the government has tons of restrictions. And that is the bottom line behind a socialist idea, where the government has lots of control of what they call the means of production, socialist slash communist. Now, socialism is on a scale, which I would say you could call it communism at the one extreme of the scale, where government has total control in places like in China, where you basically had up until the 70s, the government had taken over all property. And that was a big challenge, and took away property through revolutions, through slaughter, through all kinds of things like that. Also, that occurred in the USSR. Now, socialism is kind of like, it's like a shade of communism, where the government, especially in South America, starts expropriating a lot of businesses. So you're operating in a situation where you don't know if you're going to be in business tomorrow, because the government might decide that your business looks very attractive. We, of course, saw that in Nicaragua. We've seen that in Argentina, also, of course, in Venezuela, which I've featured before, definitely in Cuba. We certainly have it also in other countries in South America. Big challenges, Central and South America. And so in Argentina right now, there's a new guy, Milei, who has made his way to the top, new president, because he had a chainsaw, and he said he's basically going to cut all this red tape and cut through the corruption and the crap going on in that society. And we'll see. Argentina has been suffering at least since the 1990s, but again, it has a heritage and poise to move ahead, get past all this kind of stuff. So we'll see if it does. And so I wanted to see what else I wanted to mention here in this particular video. So the bottom line, the whole big idea behind my video is I'm more of a libertarian in some ways, meaning that, what does libertarian mean? It means that I don't think the government should have its meat hooks into a lot of parts of society, because unfortunately there's too many inefficiencies and corruption with the government. I think it's a lot better if you can have private ownership in many parts of society, meaning that you're allowing business owners to get in and compete. Where that can be really a plus is, say, in the telecommunications industries, other industries, electricity, places like that, where if businesses can compete with each other, we're going to be given the best rates. The problem is, when you have a monopoly from government, is they're not inclined necessarily to give everyone the best rates. So governmental monopolies that we saw, like in Venezuela, lead to having inefficiencies, a lot of times crony people running it by, that's what happened with Hugo Chavez. He put all his friends into these different businesses. And so we saw that kind of challenge. And so those are some of the challenges associated with these places. And so what else I wanted to just mention about this kind of stuff is, so when we have that, it ends up being a problem. Now, in the United States, just to sum this up, what's going on over here? We've got a lot of benefits, because if you want to start a business in the United States, it literally takes about 30 seconds. I've done it before. I've started businesses here in the United States. It's very easy. All I had to do was contact the state, Florida, and I filled out some paperwork and I did a few things, and I was able to do it myself. I didn't even need to have a lawyer or an accountant or anything like that. We had a furniture business in South Florida with 4 different locations operating for a while down there. We ended up selling the business, and then we went into a different type of business down in South Florida that has been very competitive. It's done very well down there. And it's because we don't have all of the bureaucratic red tape that you have in other parts of the world. We're operating in an at-will state, meaning you can hire and fire at will. It doesn't need to, in the absence of you have to make sure you're legally hiring and firing. You're not doing it by illegal reasons. You're not doing it to violate a public policy or anything like that. But you can hire and fire at will. That is something that they don't have in many parts of the world. And that is why it's restrictive. We also are in a place where if we want to make money, we don't have to start a business. I don't have to pay the government massive amounts of money, like 4 times my salary. I can't even imagine having to start a business, having to come up with that. That is something that you do have to do in other parts of the world. I don't have all the legal regulations. I do have to pay sales tax in Florida. So that is something I have to worry about if I'm, for products and services. You do have to pay sales tax. And you do have to pay, of course, the tax from the business's success. One of the reasons Ireland drove a lot of success, especially after the 2008 fall was because in Ireland, they decided to really reduce the corporate taxes down to pretty much null to attract businesses. And it was able to bring in a lot of people and a lot of interest from companies into Ireland. But I digress. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I just wanted to talk today about socialism, communism, human rights, the rule of law, property rights, and some of the failings that we've seen around the world, and some of the stresses that are going on, some of the reasons why some businesses are more successful than others in parts of the world, why the United States is still an economic powerhouse, because despite our inefficiencies in government that we do have, unfortunately, and some of the corruption that we have seen, especially lately in our government, we still have a great environment for operating businesses. We still are promoting the idea of free markets and capitalism and innovation and entrepreneurship. And so those are some of the reasons why the United States has been able to be very competitive. We'll never be able to be a socialist government in the ways that they're operating in the, say, Nordic countries, because again, number one, we're too large, we're far too diverse, and we do have high levels of corruption and low levels of trust with respect to our feelings about our government, unfortunately. And so when you have those kind of factors put together, it's never going to work that way. We in the United States, many people have this idea from the 1970s, don't tread on me. Ronald Reagan said, get the government off the people's backs. That is a motto that has driven a lot of people in society. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. Please like, subscribe if you like this kind of content. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you.